Thanks for having me again on this second day. I guess this is more of a sort of special interest kind of topic. But yeah, so I'm Christian. I work for Canonical right now, and I'm mostly doing upstream work on LXD and anything related to containers, basically. And one of the interesting challenges that we are sort of facing right now is basically combining different cgroup versions. What that means is essentially you run one version of the cgroup file system on the host, and you run a different version of the cgroup file system in a container. And yeah, that's actually going to be quite interesting. So I guess I want to start off like just a quick reminder of what cgroups are, and I hope I'm not boring you too much with this, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about what they are, because I assume most people here in this room will probably have some kind of familiarity with cgroups, right? So who knows about cgroups and what they basically do? Oh, that's a few. So the thing is, basically, it's just a pseudo kernel file system, like, for example, defpts or a bunch of others, that basically follows the VFS requirements. And cgroups are essentially nothing more than a collection of processes. And they allow for resource management and resource tracking of these processes. But what I mean by resources here are things like CPU, network, block I/O, and that stuff. And these resources are usually implemented or referred to in the cgroup world as so-called controllers. And I try to be consistent when referring to them. I always fail during my talks, but I at least try. Cgroups go along actually with containerization quite naturally, because usually what you want is not just to isolate a set of processes, for example, given a bunch of namespaces or so on. You likely also want them to just have access to a limited subset of the resources that your system exposes to you. And cgroups essentially allow you to just do that. So they expose a bunch of files under a specific mount point on your host that allow for read-write operations, and by writing to those files you set limits, and by reading from those files you can essentially get limits. And all of these controllers can expose to you different files, basically, depending on what kind of limits they allow you to read or set. What is interesting about cgroups right now is that, and what a lot of people don't know, well, I guess by now a lot of people will know, but was not known for a longer time, is that they come in two different versions, because user space has basically been for a long time only exposed to one version of the cgroup file system, which originally was cgroup v1, which is what we all standardly, or which we know. Like, this is the cgroup version that we all are acquainted with. But for a long time they come in a second version, cgroup v2, and since kernel 4.5 basically, this earlier experimental feature comes basically as a stable feature of the kernel, meaning you could potentially work with this from user space. That's at least the idea. Cgroup v1 is usually referred to as the legacy hierarchy. Well, basically, since cgroup v2, it's referred to as the legacy hierarchy. And what you see right here is nothing more but the, mount layout of a cgroup v1 file system. So what you see right here, it's usually mounted under sysfs cgroup. This is the standard mount point. And then you see right here a bunch of different controller names. The thing is, and this is the interesting, or one of the interesting parts of cgroup v1, that each of those controllers you see right here actually forms a separate cgroup hierarchy. That's obviously a lot of complexity, right? So you can, that's the standard layout, meaning some of those controllers are mounted into a single hierarchy, like, for example, CPU and CPU accounting, and then you have a symlink from the individual controllers to this combined mount point. But that's it allows for a lot of flexibility. And what do I mean when I say like separate hierarchies, actually? So separate hierarchies for each controller, what I mean by that is, if you look at this, The CPU set controller, it's mounted under sysfs cgroup CPU set, and the freezer controller, let it be mounted under sysfs cgroup freezer. And what you see right here in the CPU set controller, you have a range of separate cgroups like C1, C2, and C3. Then you have a bunch of cgroups or 2 cgroups underneath C1, and then you have a bunch more under C2. And that's all like sort of, that's the hierarchy we're talking about. And then if you look at the freezer controller, the layout is completely different, or could be completely different. So, and that's what is meant by a separate hierarchy. So that means you have a lot of flexibility in how you want to organize C groups and your processes like along the tree. If you wanted to be, for example, completely crazy, is maybe a bit of a stretch, but you could have, like, for example, in the CPU set controller, a C group for 3 processes that are located in C2, and then in the freezer controller, you could have them under F2.2. So you can even do stuff like, for example, have separate threads in C2 and then another thread of the same process in the freezer C group and so on. That's all fine. I mean, that's a lot of flexibility. It allows you basically to do what you want in terms of organizing your processes. And C group v2. This is a it's nothing but a re-implementation of cgroup v1, but it's totally, to user space, it's a lot different than C1 actually. When cgroup v2 becomes a thing, essentially, meaning that it's completely replaced cgroup v1, then what is expected right now, it's going to be mounted at sysfs cgroup again. But as you can see, there are no individual controllers underneath, there are no separate hierarchies. Basically, the cgroup v2 hierarchy has just a single mount point, and then it exposes a bunch of files that, depending on what kind of controllers are enabled or not. But I'm just going to go into a little more detail about what cgroup v2 is by basically comparing it to cgroup v1, which should make things a lot more clearer. So, what I said before, first of all, is there can only be one, meaning cgroup v2 only allows you to have a single cgroup hierarchy. So all of the complexity you saw before and all of the nice features of having like C groups in different controllers amongst the hierarchy is will basically be gone. That's also why it's called unified. What is happening right now, if we take a look at this cgroup v2 mount point, instead of having controllers be separate mount points like in the legacy hierarchy before underneath sysfs cgroup, you now basically can gather from what controllers you have available, you can gather from the file cgroup.controllers. If you look in there in a cgroup v2 hierarchy and you have controllers enabled, then you will find like a string in there that basically says memory, CPU, block IO, whatever controller that they've currently implemented in the kernel, and that's also available. And if you want to like distribute them further down the hierarchy, then you basically write it into cgroup.subtree control. If you, for example, want to add the memory set controller to your descendant C groups, the ones you create underneath your current C group, then you basically just write plus memory into cgroup.subtree control, and then this controller will be enabled for the descendant C groups. And I'm just going to touch on a bunch of files today. I'm basically going to talk about cgroup.controllers, I'm going to talk about cgroup.procs, and I'm going to talk about cgroup.threads and cgroup.subtree control. At least I'm going to touch on them on a bunch of occasions. So as I said, there can only be one. Like this is one of the main things. So you enable controllers further down the hierarchy by writing into cgroup.subtree control, and that's basically it. The second, or one of the pretty big things I think people usually are not aware of, is that there is a so-called internal process constraint. And that sounds, of course, really, really complicated, but it's actually not. So if we go back to the cgroup v1 hierarchy right here, I said you can have threads and processes in all C groups along the hierarchy, right? You can have processes in C1, C2, C3, but at the same time down here, you can have live processes right here, basically everywhere in the hierarchy. Now let's abstract from that and let's just like view this as a cgroup v2 hierarchy, which is a single hierarchy. The thing is, in the cgroup v2 hierarchy, this like having processes everywhere like in the tree is gone. You can only have processes in leaf nodes, meaning if this were a cgroup v2 hierarchy, then and you would have processes in here, live processes in here, that would mean this cgroup is definitely empty. The same if you had processes in here, then this would mean these cgroups are empty. If you had live processes in C2 in the cgroup v2 hierarchy, then this would mean these are empty. So basically, the idea is in internal nodes inside of a cgroup tree, you cannot have live processes. To be fair, I should be clear here, there is a special thing going on for the CPU set controller. Recently, the upstream kernel introduced the concept of so-called threaded cgroups, where this internal process constraint is more or less relaxed, but I'm not going to go into detail about this. Basically, it was a long-standing argument between the scheduler guys and the cgroup maintainers about having threaded cgroups because it makes sense for specific scheduler workloads to have threads basically in different cgroups and also in internal nodes and so on. So there is actually a way you so to speak, can circumvent the internal process constraint. But for any regular cgroup or controller we care about right now, this internal process constraint holds up. So this is actually a pretty big restriction. One should be aware of. The third one is resource distribution, and this is something I think we touched on before briefly. In contrast to cgroup v1 to some extent, all resource distribution is so to speak top-down, meaning a cgroup can only delegate a controller if it has it enabled in the parent cgroup. That means if it is listed in, let's go back right here, in the cgroup.controllers file. And then if you want to enable it for your children's cgroups, you write the appropriate controller into the subtree control file, and then all things should be good. The interesting part about this is, if we go back once more, the interesting part about this is what does it mean if you write a controller in here and you enable it for the descendant cgroups. The interesting part, it basically means you're distributing the resources of the parent, right? So the parent has given you, that the parent has given you a bunch of controllers to access or to control because it wrote it into the subtree.control file. Then these controllers appear in your own cgroup.controllers file means now you are free to distribute them further down the hierarchy. But it means the cgroup.subtree control file actually controls or distributes the resources of the parent. That's actually quite an interesting restriction or an interesting thing. So you should be careful who is actually access to the subtree.control file, and you should also be very careful what you basically enable for a descendant cgroup because they're free to do with it what they want. Also, an interesting interaction with the internal process constraint that you get right here is basically one of the reasons why you have the internal process constraint is right now you cannot get in a situation, at least that's the idea, where the child's cgroup competes with resources from the parent, right? So imagine a scenario where you have processes right here in 2.2 and you have processes in 2.2.1 right now, and they both have sort of a given like set of resources available. They can now freely compete with each other for resources. And that is actually something, if you view cgroups as a proper tree, that's something which you definitely don't want to have. You always want to have like the parent, if the parent has its own resources, and the child should not be able to drain the parent of the resources. And that's also one of the reasons why this internal process constraint exists. At least that's, I remember parts of the justification for this specific implementation. And the last part, and I think one of the hardest parts actually, is the so-called delegation containment. What does it mean? What does delegation in general mean? It's a fancy word for saying I want to give an unprivileged user or any kind of user access to a bunch of resources by making essentially a cgroup writable to it. But it also has to do with migrating tasks from one cgroup into another cgroup. Like, for example, what you want to do in most container runtime scenarios is actually you are located in a specific cgroup. and with a bunch of processes. And what you want to do is basically create, for example, a subfolder for your runtime, which usually is called, in this case, for example, could be Docker, it could be LXD or Lexi. And then underneath this subfolder, you usually want to have, for example, a separate folder for each of your containers with a given resource distribution and a given resource limits. And it looks kind of, it assumes, if the cgroup v1, this was pretty easy, right? How did you move a process around in cgroup v1? What? Genau, in cgroup v1 it was basically as easy as just writing the PID into the cgroup.prox file. This is actually not easily done in this case. What you need to do right now is a lot more complex, and we're going to touch on this on this briefly. One of the requirements is, for example, you need to have write access to the cgroup.prox file. You need to have write access to the cgroup.threads file we saw before. If you want to do proper resource delegation, you also need write access to the cgroup.subtree control file. And then you still run into the problem that you have this sort of internal process constraint, meaning you cannot just like write a bunch of PIDs into a cgroup controller underneath yourself, because then it would mean you get in a scenario where you are in a populated cgroup, meaning it has live processes in it, and your child descendant cgroup has live processes in it as well. So this is actually kind of tricky to get this thing right. So what I want to say right now, from a user space perspective, it's like coming and getting to use cgroup v2 in contrast to cgroup v1 is basically just like that. Walking into a room, be like, oh my God, like things have changed so much. I don't know what I'm doing here right now. I need to like relearn a lot of assumptions I had about cgroup in general. User space right now is, I think, not making actually a lot of cgroup v2. One of the first users right now is systemd actually. And they gained unified cgroup support a while back, which is fine. They mounted sysfs cgroup unified, is a mount point in systemd systems right now that is basically an empty cgroup v2 hierarchy, meaning it doesn't have any controllers or so available. It's just used internally by systemd for resource tracking and for process tracking. But it's not actually really well usable right now in terms of doing resource limitation. And a lot of other programs in user space don't even care about cgroup v2 right now. I don't, at least don't know of any specific program that makes use of it. Especially other init systems like OpenRC and so on. They simply don't care about cgroups. They don't manage cgroups. That's up to the user if they want to do it. So for user space, apart from systemd, it's not really a thing. And if we look at container runtimes, actually, well, it's kind of the similar situation like I outlined for init systems before, insofar, yes, there is some interest around cgroup v2. There have been discussions about cgroup v2, but most container runtimes right now just basically use cgroup v1. That is a well understood scenario that works well, but cgroup v2 to some extent has not been really an option for a lot of container runtimes, simply for the fact that a bunch of really important controllers were not available. Like, for example, for a long time the CPU set controller wasn't available, and this is quite interesting, of course, an interesting or important controller for runtimes that, for example, want to run system containers like we do with Lexi and LXD, because we want to be able to limit resources, especially for the CPU controller, so the parent doesn't get in a situation where basically a container eats up all the CPU cycles and so on. And I think until there's proper feature parity with cgroup v1, not a lot of container runtimes will like fully switch over to cgroup v2. We will definitely be supporting cgroup v2, and this is actually something that you can do right now. So, for example, now this starts again where I'm blindly typing stuff on my keyboard, which is my own fault, but for example, this should be a container that basically, we can look at the mount output probably. So you should see right here that there's only a single sysfs cgroup mount point, so you can see that actually right here, this is a cgroup v2 hierarchy that is mounted. While on the host, by the way, there is Sisyphus, there is a cgroup v1 hierarchy mixed with an empty cgroup v2 hierarchy mount point. But you can see right here, so here you have a cgroup hierarchy. It's also delegated, meaning cgroup.prox is shown to an unprivileged user, cgroup. Oh, in this case it actually isn't, but basically we can use it right now even with system containers, but you cannot do any meaningful resource isolation right now. Because if you look at, for example, the cgroup.controllers file, which I said before, lists what controllers you have available in a given cgroup. What? Get cgroup.controllers. Oh, am I not in the wrong directory, right? Thanks. So you see right here it's empty, meaning you actually don't have any controllers enabled, so you cannot do any resource management at all. But yeah, you see right here it's at least usable. If we go on the host, just to illustrate this right here, and look at the cgroup hierarchy, sys fs. You see right here that this is actually a standard mount layout for a cgroup v1 hierarchy. You have a bunch of controllers, but you also have this unified mount point, which is an empty cgroup v2 hierarchy. So there's actually some combination of different cgroup file systems on the host and in a container is actually possible right now, but any meaningful interaction with it is actually, I think, not. So one of the questions we obviously have from a container runtime perspective and also from a system containers perspective is, okay, now we have this legacy hierarchy, we have the unified hierarchy as well. We obviously have a demand for people, for example, saying, I'm on a host, I'm running systemd in a fairly recent version, I'm running a cgroup v2 hierarchy, and what I want to do right now, I have a use case where I want to support, I don't know, systemd 2.20, some version of CentOS, some version of Red Hat, SUSE, or whatever, inside of the container. And likely this systemd version will not know what to do with a cgroup v2 hierarchy. So what it will try to do, it will try to mount a cgroup v1 hierarchy inside of the container. And one of the questions is, is this actually possible, or is it actually doable in a nice and easy way? And the thing is, it's actually quite complicated, especially what you need to do from a container runtime perspective. And I'm just going to, in terms of time, I'm just going to gloss over a bunch of the problems, but I'm not going to do a deep dive into them so that you can have sufficient time for questions. The thing is, we care about usually creating and populating cgroups for a container runtime, right? This is what we do. So when you spawn a container, what you want to do is you create a cgroup for the container. You move the process that sets up the container into the cgroup. You limit a bunch of resources. So you write, for example, please only access 250 megabytes, please only have access to 2 CPUs. Then you fire the init binary in the container away, and then you end up with a beautifully resource-limited container. And this is all fine, especially when considering that you have all these cases where you are privileged, meaning you're a privileged container, meaning your container setup process runs as root, no problem. If you're an unprivileged container that is started by root, meaning your setup process runs with root privileges, but then you, for example, clone a new user namespace, you write a UID and GID mapping, you make yourself unprivileged, that should also be fine. And then you have unprivileged containers managed by a privileged daemon. That's also for example, Docker does or LXD does it. So the daemon spawns the container, sets it up. It should be fine as well. But the interesting cases, and this is also a use case we have in liblxc, is where you lack any privilege at all, so to speak. You as an unprivileged user want to set up a container, meaning you are UID 1000 on the host, but you also want to run a container right now. And now you run into problems, especially with cgroups, because you need all of these privileged steps to create basically sub-cgroups. and inside of the unified hierarchy. And it means this is actually the steps that you need to do, and we can talk about these. But basically, you first of all need write access to the C group you want to place yourself, or you currently are placed in, so that you can create sub-C groups. So you need to chown your current C group. Then you can create sub-C groups that you want to have, but then you also need write access to the cgroup.prox file and the cgroup.threads file. And now remember the internal process constraint. You cannot be in a situation where you have processes in a C group right here and then in a C group in a descendant C group, which means what you need to do if you're an unprivileged user or any kind of, or someone who wants to run a container, you basically need to branch right now. Meaning you need to create a C group for yourself and your processes, and on the same level of the hierarchy, you now need to create a sub-C group for the container. So it means you need to move all of your processes from C2 into this parallel C group right here, and then move the process for the container into the C group right here, where you actually want to spawn the container in and then fire away. So this is actually becomes a lot more complex than, for example, just writing the PID into the cgroup.prox file. And a bunch of these steps all require privilege. Like, in the sense, even if you have write access to the cgroup.prox and cgroup.threads file, if you have a process in the cgroup.prox file that runs as root and not your own UID, GID, you need privilege to move it into the branched C group as well. So you can see this is actually kind of a problem. I mean, for example, for what we've done for a long time is we ship a PAM module, or we've written a PAM module to basically allow for unprivileged C group delegation, because this is what you need to do when you want to do unprivileged C group delegation. So if, for example, I go into my own C group, which should be, so I need to go into unified, and then it should be user slice, user 1000 slice, I guess, and then it should be session 2 scope, and we go into right here, and what you can see is that, first of all, the group is shown to my unprivileged user, which is CHB in this case. Then the cgroup.prox file is shown to the unprivileged user as well. The cgroup.subtree control file is shown to my unprivileged user as well, and the cgroup.threads file is shown to my unprivileged user as well. And then you can see right here I have sub-C groups, for example, Lexi, there's a bunch of containers for myself underneath that C group. So you can get around that, but you actually need privilege. You need a PAM module, and there's actually a lot of work to do before you can get fully unprivileged containers to work. But even if you have all figured out all of these steps, now you run into the situation where you want to do this is the PAM module that we essentially ship with LexCFS that allows you to do all that fully unprivileged C group delegation, so to speak. There's a bunch of people using this by now. SUSE has recently used it for making fully unprivileged containers a thing. One of my friends, Alexa, also sent a couple of patches, and it's actually a nifty idea if you want to do fully unprivileged containers. So if you want to take a look, feel free. But what if all of that works, and now you're in a situation where you can actually combine C group versions in a container and on the host? Well, unified on unified will be fine, meaning you have the unified hierarchy on the host and unified hierarchy in a container. If both init binaries know what to do with the unified hierarchy, it should usually be fine. So that's not. I consider this not to be a hard case. The same should basically be true. Well, that's interesting. If you have a legacy hierarchy on the host and you have a unified hierarchy inside of the container, it should be fine given the init system knows what it's doing, basically. So I consider this also be not one of the hard cases. The really hard cases, and this is where I want to talk about briefly, is basically a legacy on unified, meaning you have a unified hierarchy on the host and you have a legacy hierarchy inside of the container, which will usually mean the init binary inside of the container doesn't understand what cgroup v2 is. So now you run into a bunch of problems. The first problem at all is a cgroup controller. This is one of the restrictions the kernel enforces. A cgroup controller can only be enabled in one type of hierarchy at a time. Meaning, if you have bound the memory controller inside of this inside a cgroup v1 hierarchy, you cannot mount it or enable it in a cgroup v2 hierarchy and the other way around. The same for CPU and basically any other controller. So you now run into the scenario where the init binary inside of the container wants to spawn a legacy hierarchy, but none of the controllers it actually wants to mount is available because they are all bound into the unified hierarchy on the host. But that's not all. Even if you have, for example, a controller that is not bound into a cgroup v2 hierarchy, but that has not been mounted on the host, you won't be able to mount it inside of the container, especially if we're talking about cgroup namespaces, which are an additional isolation feature that basically there is a check in the kernel that says hierarchies can only be created in the initial cgroup namespace, so even if you have controllers free and not bound to a hierarchy, but they are not mounted on the host, you cannot do so inside of the container. So this actually is an interesting challenge. And also what I guess from a container runtime perspective, what you're usually interested in, and this is where it gets like especially tricky, I guess, is even if you combine different cgroup file systems, right? You have cgroup v2 and cgroup v1, you want to do resource translation in both, or resource management in both, meaning you have a legacy, you have a unified hierarchy on the host and you have a legacy hierarchy in the container. You want to do inside of the container because you have delegated a bunch of resources to the container. Say like, for example, the container wants to create another sub-C group for a collection of processes for which it wants to limit the resources it has been given from the host. Also, for the processes inside of the container, you actually cannot do this right now because there is no way for the cgroup v2 hierarchy or cgroup v1 hierarchy inside of the container to actually know what is going on. There is no translation mechanism between these cgroup file systems. And we have been thinking about this well, very hard, but we have been thinking about how to do this actually. So to be in a situation where, first of all, you combine different cgroup file systems inside the container and outside the container, and second of all, where you can do resource limits inside of the container for a different hierarchy than you have on the host. And one of the ideas is basically to use this LexCFS file system I've talked about before, which is basically a fuse file system that mocks a cgroup hierarchy. And then expose a bunch of files or a fake cgroup hierarchy to the container so that it looks like, oh, by the way, this is a cgroup file system. And then every request that basically gets made by the container writing into one of those mock files goes through Fuse, which is not nice performance-wise. But Fuse then basically translates it to a usable resource limit in another cgroup hierarchy. And that's how you get resource translation for containers. How feasible and how scalable it actually is remains to be seen. It's an interesting challenge. I have started working on patches for this, but this is sort of where we're going, and this is kind of the solution we were thinking about. For a longer time, I was also thinking about basically doing something like resource translation between cgroup file systems inside of the kernel, and rightly so, the kernel guys, the cgroup maintainers, basically yelled at us and we're like, that's not going to happen. And they're actually right. It's a lot of complexity code you would carry inside of the kernel, but there's definitely a user space demand for this kind of problem. And if you have suggestions or you want to work on patches for this as well, with LexCFS, feel free. And thanks for listening, I guess. I'm over time, so sorry.
Okay, it is time to ask the questions. Okay. Do you have any questions? No one?
Okay, this looks like a big mess. And I guess it's very good that we have guys like you to figure out what to do with this big mess. But maybe can you please tell us from your perspective, from user space perspective, what are the good things about the unified hierarchy?
Oh, there is a bunch of good things. For example, in the cgroup v1 hierarchy, you could actually escape, so to speak, you could escape your own resource limits. Like, for example, if you were placed into a cgroup as a root user inside of a container with a bunch of resource limits, and then they were mounted into your container, And if they weren't mounted read-write, oh, even if they're mounted like read-only, you could remount them read-write, for example, and then just like rewrite your own limits. So actually you had to do a lot of dancing around, like for example, create an inner C group and an outer C group, and then that you can't escape your limits, which was all not very nice, and actually didn't, especially when C group namespaces came up, it didn't really work nicely anymore. What, for example, the C group v2 hierarchy now allows you to do cleanly is have an option that is called NSDelegate, which is basically a secure resource delegation for root users. Meaning that a bunch of the files, like I guess cgroup.control, well, cgroup.procs, cgroup.threads, and I guess cgroup.subtree control should become unwritable, yeah, by the root user. So this is a pretty secure thing actually, and works very nicely. About the unified hierarchy. In general, like the organization is much cleaner. If you allow me to like look at the kernel side of this whole thing, for example, the implementation is also way cleaner and simpler, which was, I guess, also one of the reasons why for a long time this whole we don't want to have threaded C groups discussion was going on, because like the code inside of the kernel was just way cleaner without like this complexity right now. But yeah, there are a bunch of good things. Like for example, another thing I like is that the resource for most controllers, the resource distribution is actually strictly top down. You don't have a situation where you compete for resources with your parent C group and so on. So in this way, it's actually way nicer. It's also nicer insofar you just have a single mount point. There's SysFS C group, there's a bunch of files in there, you have a bunch of controllers, depending on what controllers you have enabled, you have a bunch more files and so on. Instead of what you need to do right now when you, for example, want to expose a C group hierarchy inside of a container, you have to look at cat proc self C group. Then you have to parse out basically all of the controllers and the hierarchies they are mounted in, and then you need to basically remount or remock the hierarchy that you see on the host for the container when you mount it. All of that with the cgroup v2 hierarchy is basically gone. You look at cat procs of cgroup once, you detect there is only one controller, or there's no controller actually. You figure out the base C group you're currently located in, and then you mount it at SysFS C group, and then you're done. It's pretty nice. So.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Sim.
So from what you're saying, it's quite a controversial thing because at the same time, C groups V2 bring a lot of good and a lot of complexity at the same time. So do you think that in the future there will be, like, there is a chance that there will be only one type, or?
I guess like this is an interesting question. So yes, I guess the idea is you obviously at some point only have one type of C group file system inside of the kernel, meaning nobody's using the legacy hierarchy anymore. But as with anything in software, and especially with the Linux kernel, it's like C group v1 is going to stay around forever, like inside of the kernel. Like you will always be able to somehow mount it, I guess, if you need it. But it's the use case is sort of, the idea is probably to fade it out. So meaning newer distros in, like, let's say maybe a year when it like has feature parity with v1, will only use cgroup v2 hierarchy, and cgroup v1 is basically opt-in if you really need it. So yeah, so it's going to fade away in terms of use. It's never going to go out of the kernel, I think. I mean, there is code in the kernel that is so ancient, it just exists in there for very specific corner cases. I mean, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, we have to select the best one. It's you.
Right, what was a... actually, I like this one best this time.
He is not eligible.
I can't have this t-shirt.
Then
Actually, I have one more question, by the way.
What the fuck are you talking about? No.
Yeah. Yeah, that would definitely be the best question, but I have another one. You said about the lack of feature parity between the two. So what are the most important things you still need in Unified?
So this is just strictly speaking from a container runtime perspective. Other people might have other use cases. I think devices cgroup is definitely extremely important, especially for privileged containers. And for us, it's also the freezer cgroup. Because of what it basically, even though freezer never worked correctly, a lot of people would argue what freezer cgroup basically allows you to do is freeze a container at once, and then you can deliver a signal to all of the bits inside of the container at once, which is a pretty nice thing if you want to kill off a container pretty easily. And this is like also one of the only requirements we have. Actually, for fully unprivileged containers, there is only a single check whether the freezer controller is available, and so these two things are missing, and that's, I guess, devices and freezer. That's the two things I wanna see. Yeah, landed, but I'm not even sure actually if freezer is going to make it. I haven't followed the LKML mailing list about this. Devices cgroup is definitely being worked on, so that's going to be a thing.
Thanks.
Okay, if there are no any other questions, thank you very much for the presentations.
Thanks.